Hey, thanks for checking back into this bootcamp series. At this point, we're working on wrapping up the design chapter so we can hop into the programming chapter. However, while we are still focused on design, there are just a few more ideas, topics, and resources that I want to share with you. So in this video, we're going to do several things. Number one, I want to share with you a note-taking strategy. The idea behind the strategy is to prevent you from feeling overwhelmed. Number two, I want to show you how you can pull inspiration from your favorite websites and continue to learn CSS. So for a bit of a sneak peek preview, we're going to look at the stripe.com pricing page, and we're going to create a similar background effect with the shapes together. Okay, and then number three, we're going to look at a piece of design software that I'm a big fan of. Okay, that's enough for this introduction. Let's jump into the action. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about my note-taking strategy. So when you're working through a bootcamp series like this that's going to touch on a lot of different technologies, I think the biggest challenge is to avoid feeling overwhelmed. The most common problem I see with people learning code is that they try to learn everything at once. And this goes against basic human nature. We can only learn about so many new topics before we get overwhelmed, and it's just information overload and we get frustrated. So, before we go any further in this series and mention any additional new topics, I first want to share with you an approach to limit some of the stress and anxiety that comes from hearing about so many different topics. Essentially, and this is not groundbreaking news, I recommend taking notes. Now, everyone learns differently, so if you have a note-taking system that works for you, by all means, keep doing it. But what I'm suggesting here is instead of taking notes about things you understand and that we've already covered, instead I want you to take notes on the topics that we've heard about but haven't actually covered yet. Let me explain what I mean. So right now we're not trying to become an expert at design or CSS. That can come later. Right now, we want to keep our momentum rolling and we want to be able to get to the other chapters in this bootcamp series. However, that doesn't mean we've learned everything there is to learn about CSS and design. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to start a notes file either on your computer, just in a text file, or your favorite note-taking app, or even with a real physical pen and paper. And let's start taking notes on topics that we've heard about but haven't actually covered yet. I'll type out a few examples with you in just a moment, but this way we don't need to learn about these things right now in this very moment. And so we don't need to get sidetracked on a bunch of tangents, but also our brains can relax knowing that these interesting topics are not gone forever. We're not going to forget about them. Or actually, it's okay if we forget about them because we have our notes. So there's no hurry, we don't need to rush, we don't need to stress. We can revisit our notes either at the end of this bootcamp series or in between a lesson when we have free time. Or I can even create extra credit videos on some of these topics at the very end of the bootcamp series. Anyways, let me show you a few examples. So in the notes file, I would just say media queries. So this is how you can use different CSS for different screen sizes. So in that hour-long page layout lesson, we did create the column area that has 3 columns on a large screen and then 2 columns on a narrower screen and then only 1 column on a smartphone. And that's great. CSS Grid allows us to accomplish that. However, in order to truly optimize your designs for different screen sizes, eventually you will need to learn about media queries. This will let you send different CSS properties and values to different devices. However, we don't want to jump down this rabbit hole right now. So that's the whole point of this notes file. So we don't need to stress about this. We know that we can jump back and revisit and research this anytime that we have downtime or even at the end of this series. Okay, let's take another note. Let's say Flexbox. So learn more about positioning content in CSS. So you might remember when we created that page layout in the hour-long video, we used Flexbox for the very top header to have one piece of content aligned to the left and the other piece of content aligned to the right. Well, Flexbox is a very deep topic, so eventually you will want to do a bit of research, find a few tutorials, and learn more about Flexbox than what we've covered. Okay, On a similar note, I would also say CSS grid. So again, it's just learn more about positioning content in CSS. Okay, and then another one would be responsive images. So this is how you can send different sized image files to different devices based on their size and pixel density. Okay, that's enough note-taking for now, but the idea is we can now continue forward in this series and move on to other chapters like programming and servers and databases, and hopefully let go of some of the stress of feeling like we need to learn everything about everything along the way. We can revisit these things later if we decide we want to learn more about them, but perhaps design isn't an area you want to specialize in anyways. So in that case, there'd be no sense in getting distracted on these topics before first, at least, learning about programming and servers and seeing what interests you the most. Okay, so that's it for the notes for now. Let's change gears, and now I want to show you one of the most self-guided and fun ways of learning more about CSS, which is taking inspiration from other websites and looking behind the scenes of how they're doing what they're doing. So for example, let's take stripe.com. I think everyone agrees it's a very beautifully designed website. And in particular, if we go to their pricing page, I think this background shape effect is super cool. And we might be curious, how in the world are they creating this with HTML and CSS? Well, check this out. On any website in the world, you can just right-click anywhere on the page. Actually, to be more specific, maybe let me right-click on this headline here. And if I then click Inspect, well, that's going to bring up my Developer or DevTools window. Now, all web browsers, including Microsoft Edge and even Safari, they do have DevTools, but you might need to enable them. So in order to follow along with me in this video, I encourage you to use either Google Chrome or Mozilla Firefox. But once you inspect an element and it opens up your DevTools, notice it selected that particular element. So it's a heading level 1, and if I click this icon here to expand it, this little arrow, there you see the actual text. Now what's cool though is if I move my mouse around the different HTML elements listed in this view, notice in the background in real time it's selecting the element in question. So if I was curious how this green background with the different rectangle shapes, if I was curious how that's being created, I would maybe just right-click somewhere on it and click Inspect. So that takes me to the header. Now with that clicked on and selected, notice on the right side of the screen, we see all of the CSS being applied to that element. And actually, before we go on, I do want to let you know that by default, the first time you open up your DevTools or Inspector, I believe it will be docked to the side of your screen or the bottom of your screen, either like this, right? So over on the side, or it might be docked to the bottom like this. I can't remember what the default is, but I recommend maybe undocking it. So again, to do that, I just click these 3 little dots and then chose this icon. And that creates a separate window, so then you can really position it wherever and however you want, so you can see the actual web page in the background, but it's totally up to you. Anyways though, when you click on an element, you can see any CSS being applied to it. So I don't see any interesting CSS being applied to the header, but if I dig in, I see this div called stripe background, and inside of it I see a div with a class of stripe S0, and if I click on that, aha, so I'm seeing those familiar green colors. And then even below that div, I see this other div, and if I click on that, you can see in the background that's lighting up just this one little green shape. So this div is responsible for this sort of dark green shape we see right about here. Now, this design that Stripe has created is fairly advanced, but I'm just trying to let you know that anytime you see a cool website that you like, you can sort of reverse engineer it, or you can look under the hood and inspect what's going on. Now, like I said, this green background is a bit advanced. However, if we scroll down to this area, I would like to walk through how to create this effect with you. Right? So there's this piece of content, and it has a subtle shadow, but then beneath it, right, sort of layered behind it, we have these interesting shapes that are at an interesting angle. And you might be curious how in the world we could create this. So right now, I'm going to somewhat recreate this effect in CodePen. And then once I get to the new concepts that we don't know how to do yet, we can use our inspector tool to see how Stripe is doing it. Okay, now before we see what Stripe is doing, let's set up the basic skeleton. So first, I'm going to create an overall div for just sort of this overall section. And then inside of it, I'm going to have an inner div for this box, right? This area that has the subtle shadow and the actual text content. So here I am in CodePen, in the HTML. Let me create an overall div, and I'll give it a class of section. So this is just going to represent the entire area, both with the content itself and the cool background effect. Okay, then inside that div, let's have another div with a class of container. So let's give it a bit of placeholder text inside the container. I'll say heading level 3, hello, this is the content. And then maybe below that, I'll have a couple of paragraphs. Okay, now for the CSS, I will target the overall section and give that a bit of padding vertically, right? Because you can see this area only takes up this space, but there's room both above it, you can see the shapes here, and below it, the blue shape down here. There's space above it and below it for the area behind it to appear. So on the overall section, I'd probably say padding, maybe 100 pixels vertically, and just 20 pixels horizontally. Okay, then below this, let's create a new rule that targets the container. So dot container, curly brackets. Let's give it a maximum width of 700 pixels and let's center it. So I would just say margin 0 auto. Let's give it a background color of white. And just temporarily so we can see what's going on, let's give the section a background color of gray. Okay, now if we look at the preview, we're starting to see the overall skeleton. So this is the box that can have the subtle shadow, and then the gray area is where the blue art or the different blue shapes can live. Okay, let's go ahead and style the inner container box. So I'd probably want to give it a little bit of padding. I'd say padding maybe 50 pixels vertically and 80 pixels horizontally. Okay, now this is about all that we can do just based on the knowledge we've learned in the bootcamp series so far. To go beyond this, let's use the inspector tool. So let's see how Stripe is doing this. For example, let's see how they're creating this shadow. So if I right click on the element that I think is creating the shadow and choose inspect, well, it highlights this div with a class of content. But notice that when I hover over that element, notice what's lighting up in the background. Let me move this so it's out of the way. When I hover over that div of content, you can see it's not the overall element we're interested in, right? It's just this little section. So instead, I would look up the HTML tree, or I'd look for its ancestor, and I would just start hovering over them until I find the one that looks like a match. So notice that when I'm hovering over this div, that's selecting the area that I'm interested in. So let's look at the CSS being applied. In this right-hand column, I'll look for something that I'm either not familiar with or something that sounds like it's related to shadows. So I can see it's got a bit of padding. If I keep scrolling down, it's using Flexbox for its positioning. Okay. Keep scrolling down. It's getting a bit of padding again. Keep scrolling. It's got a background color of white. It's got a border radius so the edges are rounded. Aha! Box shadow. Now let's say I really like the exact shadow effect that they've created. Well, you can actually just copy and paste this. So I would just copy from box shadow and just grab the entire value to the ending semicolon. Just copy that into your clipboard and back in VS Code on our container, just paste it in. So now if I look, awesome, you can see that exact same subtle shadow on our element. Now that we have that shadow in place, we don't actually want the overall section to have a gray background. So I would actually just get rid of this background gray on the section. Cool, so already this is starting to look like the Stripe layout, right? We have this container with a subtle shadow. So now we would just want to learn how to place sort of these unique shapes in the background. So I would just right click on these blue shapes right here and choose inspect. Okay, so that selects the overall HTML section. We didn't go over this yet, but instead of div, you can also just create a section element. Right, so div is short for division or section, same thing. Section has a bit more semantic meaning than just a div, so you'd really only want to use section for the actual important different sections of your page, whereas div is a bit more universal. Any sort of little tiny generic area on your page can be a div, but really let's not split hairs and get into div versus section, that's a different topic. For now though, notice that when I hover over this, that is sort of selecting or highlighting the entire area. So now you can use these little arrows to really narrow down what's actually inside this section. So I can see it really just contains two divs. One is a div with the class of container, and the other is a div with the class of common striped grid anchor bottom. Now when I hover over this container div, it's pretty obvious just based on the selection that's blue here that that's the actual content. So that makes me wonder, well, what is this other div? So if I expand it, well, I see two other divs inside it, background container and stripe container. And when you hover over them, look at the background, it's pretty clear that that's what's controlling those blue shapes. Now with this overall div selected, in the right-hand column for the CSS, I notice that it says position absolute, top, bottom. Now I realize I'm sort of cheating right now because I know what to look for in CSS and I realize a beginner wouldn't. But I think you'll be surprised that if you just start experimenting with these values, you can maybe get a clue for what they do. So one of the cool things about the Inspector DevTools is you can modify these values on the fly. So for example, if I uncheck this position absolute, well, notice the blue stripes changed where they're sitting. So with it enabled, they sit behind the other content. But if I disable position absolute, well, now the blue stripes, they don't even really begin until after this other piece of content. So I can let you know that position absolute is how you can take a piece of content out of the natural flow of the page, meaning it no longer cares about the neighboring content before it or after it in the HTML, and instead you're sort of positioning it wherever you want in relation to its parent element. Now before we jump into CodePen so I can really explain how position absolute works, I do want to show you that you can manipulate these values on the fly. So I could say width, and then if I click on the 100%, I can use the arrow keys on my keyboard. So I'm pushing the down arrow on my keyboard, and notice I'm changing those values in real time. Check out the web page in the background. Okay, so even if you're not exactly sure what a value or property does, you can uncheck checkboxes to make them stop being applied, and then you can also just experiment with different values and sort of see what changes. So that's a more hands-on way of figuring out what the different properties do. However, at this point, let me show you how position absolute works. So back in CodePen, let's do this. Inside our section div, but before the container, so as a sort of sibling to the container, let's have a div and call it shapes. Okay, and then inside that div, let's have one div called shape1. So div.shape-1, hit tab. Okay, and then let's set up a bit of basic CSS. So this appears to be a blue rectangle. So in the CSS, I'd say dot shape-1, curly brackets. I'd say background-color, maybe hashtag 42A5F5. Semicolon. And let's just say width 100%, height 80 pixels. Okay, and there we see it in the preview area. Now this is a perfect opportunity to explain position absolute. So by default, notice the blue rectangle is sitting exactly where this container element used to sit. And now our container element is recognizing the 80 pixels of height that the blue rectangle is taking up, and our content just sort of stacks on top of each other, which is the normal behavior of a website. However, what if you want to pull an element out of this natural flow of a web page? Well, that's exactly what position absolute does. So on our shape1 rule, if I say position absolute, well, chaos ensues. So now it's as if none of the other content on the page is aware that the blue rectangle exists. The blue rectangle is off in its own fantasy land doing whatever the heck it wants. Now, when you take an element out of that natural flow of the page, this allows for content to overlap, right? Whereas previously, by default, each element will respect its neighboring content and just sort of drop down to a new line. So the question is, well, how does absolute positioning work? Well, on this same element, now we can say top, and let's say 0, left, 0. So that's going to put it in the very top left corner, meaning we haven't moved down from the top at all, we haven't moved in from the left at all. So if I change the top to 10px, notice it pushes it down 10px. Or if I say left 30px, that pushes it in from the left 30 pixels. Now it's important to point out what this is in relation to, and it's in relation to its nearest positioned ancestor element. So to make that clear, in our HTML, up on the very first line, even before our section, if I have a heading level 1 that says hello, and maybe just another little bit of content up there, notice that the blue rectangle is still just 10 pixels from the very top of the web page as a whole. However, what if we want it to be in relation to our section div? Well, in our section rule, if we say position relative, well, now our shape div that's positioned absolutely, it's going to look for its nearest ancestor that's positioned, which is the div with a class of section. So now notice this content up at the very top, this is in the natural flow of the page. And then our section div starts here. So now when we say top 10px for the blue rectangle, it's moving down 10 pixels from the top of that ancestor element that's positioned. Okay, now let's talk more about what happens when content overlaps. So on my shape one, if I push it down further from the top, so if I change top to maybe 100px, that pushes it down from the top of the section 100 pixels. Only now notice it's overlapping our container content. Whereas we would want the opposite. We want the container div to overlap the blue rectangle. So in CSS, when multiple pieces of content are sitting in the same spot or overlapping, we use a property called z-index, so z-index, to determine which one sits on top. So whichever one has the larger value will be closer to the top of the stack. So we could give this a z-index of 1 and then go to our container div and tell it to be position relative and give it a z-index of 2. Or a nice trick, and the Stripe website does this, is if you say z-index -1, well, that's going to set it sort of below the default stack value, and so now you can see it's sitting behind our container. Okay, now on a related note, notice that we have the dreaded horizontal scroll bar. This is because we set the width to be 100%, and we also pushed it in from the left 30 pixels. So instead what we could do is get rid of the width property, and just say maybe push in from the left 0, and then also give it a right value and just say 5%. In order to understand how this works, if you just tweak this value from 5 up to 10%, that pushes it in further from the right. I think you get the idea. If we put it to only 2%, all right, then it's only pushed in from the right edge 2%. So let me put that back to 5%. Okay, now on the left side, you'll notice it's not sitting flush against the edge, even though we said left 0. This is because our overall body element has margin. So we could just create a brand new rule, select body, and say margin 0. Cool, so now it's sitting flush. Okay, at this point, let's go ahead and add 2 more rectangles. So in addition to the blue one, maybe a green one and a purple one. Then once we've set that up, we can learn how to place them at a unique angle like we see here. So in our HTML, we already have shape 1. I would just duplicate this. So copy it, paste it, change this name to shape 2. Okay, then in the CSS, let's find our shape 1 rule. And I would just duplicate this entire rule, so copy it, paste it. On the new copy, change the selector to shape 2. Now if I want shape 2 to be a purple rectangle that sits below the blue one, I would just adjust its top value to be 180 pixels, because the original blue rectangle is pushed down 100 pixels, and then it takes up 80 pixels of its own height. So to give the illusion that the purple rectangle sits below it, let's say 180. Okay, let's change its background color to 4527A0. Okay, let's position the purple rectangle so it sits in 5% from the left edge, but sits flush on the right edge. So I would just set left to 5% and set right to 0%. Cool, and then finally let's have a third shape that is green. So in our HTML, just create one more div, give it a class of shape-3, hit tab. In our CSS column, just paste in a rule, should still be on our clipboard. Change the selector to shape3. Let's set the left to 10% and set the right value to 0. And let's give it a background color of AED581. Whoops, so I forgot to calculate the top value. So currently it's just the 100 pixels from the top when I pasted that in. So instead, in addition to that 100, we want to go 80 to go to where the purple one is, and then another 80 to go to where the purple ends. So let's try a top value of 260. Cool, that looks good. At this point, let's jump back to the Stripe website and we can figure out how to place these shapes at a unique angle like we see here. So back in my inspector for the Stripe website, as I hover over these different divs, I notice that when I hover over this div, the selected blue area in the page behind me, well, it itself is actually at an angle, right? Instead of just the standard rectangles like we see here, this one is actually rotated. So if I click on that div and then take a look at its CSS, well, I see that it's using flexbox, I see that it's positioned absolute, but also I see transform skew y -12 degrees. And I can uncheck this box and then also uncheck this WebKit or Chrome specific property that's the exact same thing. And notice that with that unchecked, well, that unique angle is gone. So now it's just these basic rectangles just like we have. So really, this is all we need to implement on our design. So I would just copy and paste this transform and the value here. So I just select this, copy it back in CodePen. Now the question is, where do we want to place this? And instead of having to rotate or skew all three of our different shapes individually, let's just apply it to our div with a class of shapes that is containing all of the shapes. So I would just create a brand new CSS rule targeting shapes, curly brackets. I would just paste in my clipboard. And now we don't want the elements to overlap the actual content. So on this shapes container div, we would want to say z-index -1, position absolute. And let's just set this div to take up all of the available space of the section parent. So to do that, you can just say top 0, bottom 0, left 0, right 0. Okay, and if we're telling the overall shapes div to have a z-index of -1, we don't need that on each individual shape now. So I would just go into shape 1, we don't need the z-index, and then do the same thing for shape 2 and shape 3. Okay, now by rotating or skewing the content, that might go outside the bounds of our overall section. So what you can do on our section div is say overflow hidden. So now notice where the shapes would have exceeded the edges of the section, that extra part is now hidden. Now I think these colors we chose might be drawing too much attention. We do want them to sort of just fade into the background, so we could always just lower the opacity on our shapes div. So I could say opacity 0.5 or maybe even 0.3. Okay, so we've essentially recreated that effect. Now obviously it doesn't look exactly like the Stripe website, but the idea is I want you to be able to dig into the inspector and start experimenting. Now at this point I do want to point out that this lesson has become half an hour long, and we've sort of proven my point from earlier, which is, let me jump back to my notes, that design is an incredibly deep and complex topic, and we could spend months or even years trying to learn everything there is about CSS and graphic design. But that's not the point of this bootcamp series. Okay, we do want to be able to move on to the other chapters like programming, servers, databases, user authentication. So I realize we just went through 20 or 30 minutes of just a CSS exercise, but hopefully it taught you a little bit about your DevTools inspector and the idea was to learn how to learn. So what I recommend from here is a nice mixture of both looking up tutorials on CSS topics, but also just digging through websites that you like the look of. And these two things can sort of feed off each other. When you look through a design and you see a property that you don't understand, just search YouTube for that property and value pair. I can almost guarantee there's already an excellent tutorial on YouTube that will explain it in detail. So you don't have to go at this alone, but it's fun to discover new properties and then perform your own research, right? Or if you watch a tutorial and it doesn't quite make sense, you can always go into your DevTools and sort of experiment with the values in real time. And I think between those two things, right, so supplemental videos and tweaking in your DevTools, you'll gradually learn CSS over time. But big picture, I would say don't focus or don't obsess on being a CSS expert this week or even this month. Unless you know that design is really the area you want to focus your career on, I would say let's look at the bigger picture and let's start looking towards moving on to the other chapters. Having said that, before we close out this video, I do want to talk a little bit about design software instead of just focusing 100% on code. So right now in a new tab, I strongly encourage you to search for Figma. As of today, the domain is just figma.com. So earlier in the series, you saw me use Figma to resize an image, but that's really not what Figma is for. In reality, Figma is a tool that lets you create prototypes or wireframes or even actual graphic designs for user interfaces. And also it lets us create vector illustrations. It does a lot of different things. It's hard to even summarize everything it does, but I strongly encourage you to sign up for a completely free Figma account. I won't bore you by walking through the sign up process with you, but once you have a Figma account, you can create a brand new document. And right now, I just want to show you two quick things in Figma. So number one, I want to show you how you can use it to interact with your CSS code or supplement your CSS code. And then number two, I want to show you how you can export your vector illustrations from Figma onto your web page. So first though, let's start with how it can relate to your CSS code. So in a new document here, let's imagine I create a rectangle. And then over here, I can change the color, right? So if I set it to this color or maybe something like this, that's great, but you can also have a gradient. So if I click this button, then I can add a second color, and now I could choose maybe this for the first color and then sort of a darker blue for the second color, right? And you could even add a third color where it's a gradient between three colors. There's really no limit, but the idea now is, what if you wanted to use this gradient in your CSS? Well, with this shape selected, I can just click on Code up here towards the top right corner, and notice it's giving me CSS. Now the property in particular that I'm interested in is this background. So I would just select that entire background colon, linear gradient, all the way to the ending semicolon, just copy it into my clipboard, back in CodePen. Imagine I wanted to use that as the color for the first shape. I just find shape 1. Get rid of the background color property and instead just paste in my clipboard. And check that out. It's now using that exact gradient. So the idea is you can use Figma not just to pick colors and gradients, but you can create something that looks like a website visually in Figma. And then once you have it looking the way you want it to look, then you can sort of convert it yourself into HTML and CSS. That way, you're using all of your brain horsepower on the creative process of just what looks good, right? You can just focus on the creative decisions, and then once everything looks nice, then you can use your brain's horsepower to write the code. So maybe tomorrow night, I encourage you to spend 10 to 30 minutes looking up Figma tutorials on YouTube. Now, in addition to using it as a design or prototype tool, you can also create vector illustrations in Figma. Now again, this is not a Figma or illustration tutorial. This is a coding bootcamp tutorial, so I'm not going to walk through step by step how you would create these. That's sort of the whole point of tomorrow night, maybe spending a little time to research Figma. But what I want to show you is that you can export these from Figma into your website. And the cool thing is that a vector illustration, which is made up of shapes instead of pixels, it can scale infinitely. And in a world where our smartphones have higher pixel densities every year, it's great to have something that can scale infinitely and always look razor sharp. Let me show you what I mean. So if I click on my cat illustration here, and down in the export area, if I export it as an SVG, which stands for Scalable Vector Graphic, it's going to save into my Downloads folder. Now I could add this to a website by creating an image element and then just pointing the src or source attribute towards this file. Or better yet, check this out. If I open this file in my text editor, so I just opened it in Visual Studio Code, and now if I just select the entire contents of the file and copy it into my clipboard and then in CodePen, maybe at the very bottom of my HTML, I don't need to create an image element. I can literally just paste that code for the SVG element, and there we see the cat. So this way the visitors of my website, they don't even need to download an extra file. This code here just creates that illustration. Now you can't do that with a JPEG, but with an SVG, a scalable vector graphic, you absolutely can. And what's nice is now no matter how much you zoom in, or no matter how high the pixel density of a device, it's always going to be razor sharp, right? A vector graphic can scale and zoom infinitely. And even aside from illustrations like my cat drawing here, if I zoom back in, look at the CodePen website itself. So the CodePen logo, this little pencil icon here, this icon here, all of these are SVG files, or not necessarily a file. As we saw, you can embed your SVG code directly in HTML, but icons are always going to be SVG in the modern web. And being an icon designer, the person who creates these icons, that can be a very lucrative career path. And a trend that I've noticed lately is that a lot of the best icon designers in the world are using Figma to illustrate their icons. So again, if graphic or visual design interests you, I strongly encourage you to check out Figma. Maybe in your free time in between our bootcamp series lessons, you can look up a few YouTube Figma guides. Personally, I'm a big fan of a YouTube channel by Mackenzie Child. A lot of the older videos are using Adobe Illustrator, but I've noticed in some of the newer videos, Mackenzie is using Figma. Anyways, that's just a channel that I enjoy. There are a ton of amazing, freely available Figma guides on YouTube. Okay, that's really all I wanted to talk about in terms of design software. Before we close out this video, there is one more thing I want to run by you, and that is CSS animations. So my favorite website for this is animate.style, or if you Google for animate.css or animate Dan Eden, either way this website should come up. But the idea is that we see these different options in the right column, and if you click on them, it shows you a quick demo. So instead of having to write animation code yourself, you can just borrow or recycle the animation CSS code from this Animate library. So there are all sorts of different options. They're a lot of fun to play with, but let's not forget my own note-taking strategy. So animations are a lot of fun, but let's add them to our notes. Let's say CSS animations. The animate.style website has animation code that we can borrow. Okay, so you can either experiment with animations on your own, or maybe at the end of this bootcamp series, I can create an extra credit video on it. Okay, but unless you're super interested in it, let's not worry about it right now, this week, this month. Whew, believe me, I am fully aware that that lesson was all over the place. I'll admit I did struggle on a way to wrap up this design chapter because I know some of you are going to love design while some of you are going to have zero interest in it and you just want to move on to programming. Now, speaking of people that have zero interest in design, our very next video is going to be about something called Bootstrap. Maybe you've heard of Bootstrap before, maybe you haven't. Either way, it's worth learning and it's our next topic. And this will be the final video in our design chapter. I hope you're having a bit of fun in this bootcamp series so far. I appreciate all of you that are working through this with me. Let's keep our momentum rolling, and I'll see you in the next one.